The 7 most terrifying plagues that shaped human history. Let's start with the plagues that merely killed millions and work our way towards the ones that killed so many people that human civilization had to be rebuilt from what was left. Number 7. The Plague of Justinian, 541 AD. In 541 AD, the Byzantine Emperor Justinian I was in the middle of what was shaping up to be a very impressive reign. He had reconquered much of the former Roman Empire, he had commissioned the Hagia Sophia, he had reformed the legal code of the entire civilized world. He was, by any reasonable measure, one of the most consequential rulers of the early medieval period. Then, the plague arrived. The Plague of Justinian was caused by Yersinia pestis, the same bacterium responsible for the Black Death 8 centuries later. It arrived in Constantinople via grain ships from Egypt in 541 AD and spread through the Byzantine Empire and beyond with a speed that the ancient world had no framework to understand. At its peak, the plague was killing an estimated 5,000 people per day in Constantinople alone. The city's population was approximately 500,000. The historian Procopius, who witnessed the outbreak firsthand, described bodies piling up in the streets faster than they could be buried. Mass graves were dug and filled and dug again. Eventually, bodies were loaded onto ships and dumped at sea. Justinian himself contracted the plague and survived. The empire did not survive intact. The plague killed somewhere between 25 and 50 million people across 2 centuries of recurring outbreaks, approximately 25 to 50% of the entire population of the Byzantine Empire. The reconquest of Rome was abandoned. The legal reforms were implemented, but the empire that was supposed to enforce them never fully recovered its former strength. History tends to be shaped by the things that kill the most people. The Plague of Justinian shaped the entire trajectory of the early medieval world.
Number 6. The Antonine Plague, 165 AD. Before Justinian, there was Marcus Aurelius, and before Justinian's plague, there was the Antonine Plague. In 165 AD, Roman soldiers returning from a military campaign in the Near East brought something back with them that the Roman Empire had no immunity to and no way of stopping. Modern scholars believe it was either smallpox or measles, 2 diseases that are so routine to the modern vaccinated world that mentioning them in the context of a catastrophic pandemic requires a moment of adjustment. The Antonine Plague killed an estimated 5 to 10 million people over approximately 15 years. At its peak, it was killing approximately 2,000 people per day in Rome alone. The Roman army lost so many soldiers that the empire's military capacity was permanently reduced. Entire provinces were depopulated. The physician Galen, who practiced medicine in Rome during the outbreak, documented the symptoms in enough detail for modern scholars to work backward to a probable diagnosis. His accounts describe fever, diarrhea, and skin pustules, consistent with smallpox. His treatments were largely ineffective. He knew they were largely ineffective. He documented that too. Marcus Aurelius, who wrote one of history's most enduring works of philosophy while managing this crisis, died in 180 AD, possibly of the plague itself. His death triggered a succession crisis that many historians identify as the beginning of the end of Rome's Golden Age. A disease that the modern world vaccinates against in infancy brought the greatest empire in history to its knees.
Number 5. The Third Cholera Pandemic, 1852. Cholera is caused by a bacterium called Vibrio cholerae that attacks the small intestine, causing diarrhea so severe that a healthy adult can die of dehydration within hours of the first symptoms appearing. There have been 7 cholera pandemics since 1817. The third, which began in 1852 and lasted until 1860, was the deadliest. It killed approximately 1 million people in Russia alone. It swept through Europe, Asia, Africa, and North America. In London, it killed over 14,000 people in a single outbreak in 1854, the same outbreak that physician John Snow mapped by tracking cases to a single contaminated water pump on Broad Street in Soho, founding the modern science of epidemiology in the process. What makes the third cholera pandemic particularly disturbing is not just the death toll, but the mechanism. Cholera is a disease of contaminated water. It spreads when human sewage enters drinking water supplies. In 1852, the cities of the industrialized world were packed with millions of people consuming water from sources that were directly contaminated by the waste of those same millions of people. Everyone knew the water smelled wrong. No one understood why the water was killing them. It took John Snow drawing a map of deaths around a single pump to make the connection visible. After the pump handle was removed, the outbreak stopped almost immediately. The entire science of public health, clean water, sewage treatment, disease mapping, emerged from people trying to understand why cholera kept killing them. The third pandemic killed 1 million people and accidentally produced the intellectual framework that has saved billions since.
Number 4. The HIV/AIDS pandemic, 1981. On June 5, 1981, the Centers for Disease Control published a report describing 5 previously healthy young men in Los Angeles who had developed a rare form of pneumonia called pneumocystis carinii pneumonia. All 5 were gay men. All 5 had severely compromised immune systems with no obvious cause. That report was the first official documentation of what would become the HIV/AIDS pandemic. HIV, human immunodeficiency virus, attacks and destroys the cells of the immune system over time, leaving the body progressively unable to fight infections that a healthy immune system would handle without difficulty. AIDS, acquired immunodeficiency syndrome, is the late stage of HIV infection when the immune system has been sufficiently destroyed that opportunistic infections become fatal. Since 1981, approximately 40 million people have died of AIDS-related illnesses. An estimated 38 million people are currently living with HIV. In the 1980s and early 1990s, an HIV diagnosis was effectively a death sentence. There was no treatment. There was no cure. There was a significant amount of political indifference in several governments toward a disease that initially appeared to affect primarily gay men and intravenous drug users. The development of antiretroviral therapy in the mid-1990s transformed HIV from a death sentence into a manageable chronic condition for those with access to treatment. Approximately 39 million people currently have access to antiretroviral therapy. Approximately 9 million who need it do not. The pandemic is not over. It has simply become quiet enough that most people in the developed world no longer think about it daily. 40 million people died in the time it took to get quiet. Number 3. The smallpox pandemic, ancient to 1980. Smallpox is the only human infectious disease to have been completely eradicated. The last naturally occurring case was recorded in Somalia in 1977. The World Health Organization declared smallpox officially eradicated in 1980. This is one of the greatest achievements in human history. It is also a reminder that for approximately 3,000 years before 1980, smallpox was killing between 300 and 500 million people per century. The disease had a case fatality rate of approximately 30%. It killed 1 in 3 people it infected. It left survivors permanently scarred. It caused blindness in approximately 1/3 of survivors. It killed indiscriminately across age, class, and geography. When European colonizers arrived in the Americas in the 15th and 16th centuries, they brought smallpox with them to populations that had no immunity to it whatsoever. In some regions of the Americas, the smallpox death toll among indigenous populations reached 90%. Entire civilizations, the Aztec Empire, the Inca Empire, collapsed not primarily from military conquest, but from the disease that preceded and accompanied it. Hernán Cortés conquered the Aztec Empire with 600 men. The Aztec Empire had millions of soldiers. The difference was not military tactics. The difference was that smallpox had already killed most of the people who would have fought him. Edward Jenner developed the first smallpox vaccine in 1796 using material from cowpox sores. It worked. It took 184 years and a global vaccination campaign to finish the job. 3,000 years. 300 to 500 million dead per century. Eradicated by a needle. Number 2. The Spanish flu, 1918. The First World War killed approximately 20 million people over 4 years.
The Spanish flu killed somewhere between 50 and 100 million people in approximately 1/3 of the entire world's population at the time. It was unusual among influenza strains in that it disproportionately killed healthy young adults rather than the very old and very young. The prevailing theory is that the strong immune response of healthy young adults, a cytokine storm, actually caused more damage than the virus itself in severe cases. The pandemic spread in 3 waves. The first wave, in spring 1918, was relatively mild. The second wave, in autumn 1918, was catastrophic. The third wave, in winter 1919, was severe. The second wave coincided with the final months of the First World War. Troops packed in trenches and transport ships provided ideal transmission conditions. The pandemic was called the Spanish flu, not because it originated in Spain, but because Spain, as a neutral country in the war, had a free press that reported on the outbreak openly. The warring nations suppressed news of the pandemic to maintain morale. American soldiers brought the virus to Europe. European soldiers spread it globally. Governments kept it quiet while people died in unprecedented numbers. The 1918 Spanish flu remains the single most lethal pandemic in recorded human history by death toll per unit time. Nothing before or since has killed as many people as quickly.
Number 1. The Black Death, 1347. The Black Death arrived in Europe via Genoese trading ships that docked at the port of Messina in Sicily in October 1347. The sailors on the ships were dead or dying, covered in black swellings filled with blood and pus at the armpits, neck, and groin that gave the disease its name. The port authorities ordered the ships out of the harbor immediately. It was too late. Within 5 years, the Black Death killed between 30 and 60% of Europe's entire population. In some cities, the death toll exceeded 70%. In others, it exceeded 80%. The city of Florence lost between half and 2/3 of its population in a single year. Giovanni Boccaccio, who lived through it and wrote about it, described a city in which the social order had completely collapsed. The sick were abandoned, the dead were left in the streets, and those who could fled without knowing that they were carrying the disease with them. The Black Death did not stop at Europe. It killed approximately 75 million people globally across its initial outbreak. It had already devastated China and Central Asia before reaching Europe. The total death toll across the 14th century outbreak and subsequent recurring waves may have reached 200 million. The world that emerged from the Black Death was fundamentally different from the world that entered it. The labor shortage created by mass death gave surviving peasants unprecedented bargaining power. Feudal systems that had been stable for centuries began to collapse. The power of the Catholic Church, which had been unable to explain or prevent the plague, was permanently diminished. The economic disruption accelerated the development of trade and banking systems that would eventually produce the Renaissance. The Black Death killed so many people that the survivors accidentally built a better world than the one that existed before, which is either the most hopeful thing in this entire video or the most disturbing.